Hi, welcome back. So this was quite a dialogue-heavy episode, but we did still get to see a little bit of progression and we got through what the bases of the game are like, both in the combat and the navigation, and from the next episode I think things are going to be much more exciting. I'm still learning how to play and talk at the same time in a way that does not detract from any of the two parts, so it means that right now I'm a bit unfocused and slow. When I try to discuss the game, there is just a lot happening at the same time, but thank you for your patience in reaching up until this point, and I'm sure I will become better in time. As you can hear, I'm trying a couple of new things. I've added music in the background, and I'm playing around a little bit with the order in which I will explain things in this section. Under the suggestion from a friend of mine, I will not be going into as much detail as I went to do in the research in a couple of topics, and I added more description in text in the video description if any of you is going to be interested about those specific topics. So regarding the order in which I will talk about the various topics that I want to go over, I've decided to change things up a bit compared to the first episode, and instead of going into chronological order as to when things happen during the video, to divide the topics into subjects. So I will start by translating the dialogues and the names of the different new NPCs that we found and talking a little bit about them, then go into the translations of the places, names, and the item description, and then finish with the cultural references and influences that were already present in this initial part of the game. And that's the part where I will use the video description to provide extra tidbits for people who are interested in those subjects. I'm not necessarily sure that this is how I will do it moving along and going into the future, but I want to try now and see which I prefer. So let's start by going over the new characters that we met at the Ruin Temple. From Software has a real knack in conveying a lot of nuance and subtlety through their dialogues and naming conventions, and this game is no exception. I personally think that it has the best characters in any From Software game that I've played, but a lot of that depth and quality is kind of hidden behind how to translate things, so I think it's very rewarding for us to go over them a little bit, starting from the names. I already talked a little bit about the sculptor's names in Japanese, how it's not just sculptor, it's Bushi, which is specifically a sculptor of Buddhist statues. And I will talk more about the importance of Buddhist sculpture in general, but so for now, let's leave him at that, and I will return to him when I translate these dialogues. Now, Emma is a fascinating name for this character, mainly because it's not a Japanese name and it is written in katakana, which is the phonetic alphabet reserved for non-Japanese words. I do not know if this implies that she's a Westerner. I cannot tell by just looking at her model if she's supposed to be a different ethnicity than the rest of the cast, but this is not to be excluded, as we will discover more about her past, that she's not from Japanese descent, but I'm not sure about that. What is certain is that the name clashes a lot with the fact that she's one of the most Japanese appearing character in the game, in the way that she acts and she talks and how she seems to embody this kind of ideal of Japanese refinement. And the names makes her out to be an outsider. It clearly defines her as someone different from the other people, in the same way in which we have official people with, a name and a surname, and they're clearly Japanese and they're part of the system, and then we have people like Wolf or the Sculptor or Emma, who just by name alone seems to be kind of outside of all of that. And lastly, there is Hambe the Undying, a very puzzling character, mainly because unfortunately he's not going to be very well developed in the base game. I've discovered recently that a prequel in the form of a manga called Sekiro Side Story Hambe the Undying was released, but I haven't read that yet, so I cannot really comment on it. I hope that in the future, when I talk more about this character, I will have that already under my belt, so I will be able to include it. But for now, what I can say is that his name seems to be something of a historical reference. There was a much more famous figure called Hambe, which was the nickname of Takenaka Shigeharu, a brilliant young strategist of weak constitution that served under Toyotomi Hideyoshi and died in 1579 at 34 years of age of a tragic illness during one of his campaigns. He's a fairly popular figure, so I don't think it was accidental. And I don't know yet how important that parallel is, but it definitely it allows us to clock Hambe as somebody who used to be a samurai, used to be involved in war, and seems to have fallen quite down in the social ladder to be found in this state, in this place. So, moving on to the translation of the dialogues. These were generally well translated in English, so except for a couple of things that were left out entirely, mostly I will be talking about differences in nuance or in tone between the English and Japanese characterization. So, starting with the Sculptor, his dialogue is in general pretty accurate, but what I felt wasn't entirely conveyed in English, for obvious reason it's very hard to convey, is he has a really weird attitude towards us, and he expresses us in the way that he speaks mostly. He seems to be randomly and casually rude in a way that is very weird in Japanese society, which is usually ultra polite, but not in a provocative way. Just, it feels like somebody who has been outside of civilization quite a lot. For example, the way that he refers to Wolf most of the time is Omae-san, which is a mixture of Omae, which is a very rude way of saying you, and san, which is a honorific, so it might have been a teasing way of referring to him or something, but it's definitely very unique. Also, in general, his attitude seems to be a mixture between being gruff and almost seemingly hostile, but in his action he's always very helpful and accommodating, and he's ready to assist us, and he saved our lives, so a puzzling character overall. Also, he refers to himself with washi, which is a way of saying I, which is reserved to older people, so he definitely seems to be not just ugly but old, and seems to think of himself as a senior of some kind. Considering that, as I already talked during the playthrough, he probably was the previous owner of the shinobi prosthetic and seems to know a lot about ninjas in general. He probably considered himself retired and is quite the old shinobi himself. Wolf, for his own part, in this dialogue is again much less hostile and more just sparse and untalkative in Japanese. When his name is asked, his original answer is a very neutral, I can't say, I can't answer that, to which the Sculptor reply is, well, that's just how shinobis are, huh? Like if he knows a lot about what being a shinobi means in practice. With this frame in mind, the rest of his dialogue is generally pretty accurate. There are just a couple of small changes that I find are interesting to point out, and a couple of inaccuracies left. The first in the questions you can ask him, the first one is actually ask about yourself and not what happened to you, which is interesting. I mean, it means the same thing, just a small interesting thing. And when Wolf says this device, I see this device, he's again using the term karakuri, which means that he basically has noticed that there is a lot of space inside of his left arm that he can fit different contraptions in. He's not referring to the whole thing as if he just noticed the entire arm is a mechanism. Then, mainly there are these two little inaccuracies. When, in this part, the Sculptor doesn't say that he said too much, like he just revealed a secret or anything like that, but he's just being self-deprecating. He's just saying something like he has already chatted for too long, or look at me talking away too much, something like that. And lastly, when talking about Kuro, he's not saying that someone is after him, he's saying that he's a target, I think in a more general sense, that his special blood just makes him a precious target for people who would want that power for themselves. Moving on to Emma. Generally, her dialogues in English are very accurately translated, except for a couple of cases in which it really isn't. They just changed some things or left out things, and I don't really understand why, but that's what I'm here for, I guess. In general, the main thing that in English they managed to convey, but not quite the full extent of it, is how formal and polite Emma's way of speaking is. She speaks like a refined noblewoman at all times. So more than a noblewoman, a refined servant. She is always extremely kind, she always apologizes, she uses a very flowery way of saying everything. She looks like she is used to living in a court. And she's a completely different person in the way that she presents herself from both Hambe and the Sculptor, who are both very rude and crude and apparently completely out of the civilization in general. As to what they changed or left out of her dialogue, the first one is a very minor one. When she talks about the dragon's blood, she's using the same word that was previously translated as dragon heritage, which can be translated as the dragon bloodline more accurately, but I don't know why they did two different translations here, there probably was just a slip. Then later, and this is probably the most important, she doesn't say that she's serving a certain master, she's saying that she serves an ally of the monkey. And as we will discover later, the monkey is the way that she refers to the Sculptor in general, so her master is connected to the Sculptor, which is probably why she's here in the first place. In English it's not entirely clear why she's here specifically, she seems to just be following us, but in Japanese it's made clear that whoever is the master that she's serving, that master is connected to the Sculptor specifically. Lastly, Wolf does not ask her for a way to improve the healing gird, like it's this weird meta question that nobody would even ask in real life. He's asking, so, what can you do for me as a doctor? Because beforehand she has told us that she will help us in her capacity as a doctor, and this is just Wolf following up on that and saying, so, what can you do for me then as a doctor? And then she replies, I can upgrade your gird, I can make it better if you find seeds. Which I feel is just a more organic way of introducing the upgrade rather than the weird meta way they used in English. And in conclusion, we have Hambe, whose English translation is generally pretty accurate. The only differences are a couple of nuances or differences in tone, so this should be pretty brief. In general, his speech pattern seems to be that of somebody who used to be a samurai of higher standing, but has lived into the wild or lived a life of poverty so much that he has lost most of the original complexity and nobility of words. But, for example, he still uses Sokomoto to refer to us, which is a very antiquated way for a samurai to refer to somebody who is equal or inferior to them. So he sounds a little bit like somebody who used to have like a fancy accent and has lived into the wild for years and still have some traces of that in the way that he speaks. Then here he's not wondering whether we are a shinobi or something else. He's saying maybe if it is by a shinobi technique, perhaps. And later when he revives, he said, as I thought, I'm still not dead. So basically, he just wanted to try if maybe one of our shinobi techniques would be the trick to killing him, but wasn't really hoping much about it. He was just saying, why not try in this case? Then later, when he explains what it is, he says it is undying, but the words in Japanese for infested is more specifically haunted by insects, in the same way that you could have like a haunted house or a haunting. So in Japanese there is this reference to insects and bugs which are infesting him. And in the last part, he doesn't say that we seem to have a lot on our mind in such an abstract way, but he remarks on how often we seem to frown. It's a very specific remark on the fact that we have a very lined and frowny face, which will come back later, I think, in the next episodes. Now, moving on from the characters to other translations, the names of the locations we encounter are generally pretty accurate, but there were a couple of small differences that I want to focus on for a little while. The first one is that Ashina outskirts in Japanese is more specifically Ashina's castle's outskirts. As to say, we are not at the border of the country, we're just at the border of the main fortified city, the capital of Ashina. The second small difference is that the last idol that we find, which in English is called the Outskirt Wall Gate Path idol, in Japanese is a little bit more details, and it's the Outskirt Outer Wall Castle Gates Path, meaning that we are now at the outer wall of the fortified city, and progressing on this path we'll encounter the main gate to go in, which doesn't change anything, but it's a little bit more detailed than what is given to us in English. Then, before moving on to the translation of the item description proper, I just want to remark that the name for the idols themselves is very different in Japanese. They are the Oni Buddhas, Oni being a word that loosely means demon or ogre, and I think this underlines the corrupted nature of the creation of the sculptor, who is supposed to be sculpting statues of Buddha, but what comes out is this demonic, corrupt version of that ideal. And now moving on to the ever-popular item description, starting from the ceramic shards. The translation in general is pretty accurate, there are only a couple of minor changes. The first one being that they're more generally called pottery shards in Japanese, using a very outdated term at that. The fact that they give the name of the game of tossing ceramic pieces to each other that the children of Ashina used to play, which is called wariko, which I think is a play on words but unfortunately eludes me. And lastly, the last line is a little bit more tongue-in-cheek in the original and more properly reads, "Even if grown up, everyone is still an expert at the game." The Ungo and Akushugas are unfortunately much more complex. Starting from their names, these are a portmanteau of those of the two guardian deities Ungyo and Agyo, and of the kanji for protection and attack, respectively. Ungyo and Agyo are fascinating mythological figures. They were warriors who escorted the Buddha on his travels and are more commonly known together as the Neo. I have included a link in the description with much more info on them, but at least by sight you probably already know of them. The description of the items are also very complex in Japanese, which is probably why they're so obscure in English. The sentence in Ungo Akushugas about enduring the excess karma of men goes something like this in original. The spirit fall is a divine phenomenon that remains in the body of man. Therefore, bite the sugar and endure. Which is also very obscure and confusing, but it creates certain links between items that in the English translation were omitted. That is, the spirit fall is going to be an item that we'll find in the future, and Akushuga reference the spirit fall in more detail. Also, the original text makes it seem like the sugars were not spread to honor Ashina's past heroes like in English, as much as to actively help out those that bravely still defend their lands. In the description of the Akushuga, the meaning of spirit fall is then expanded upon. It describes what happens when you bite the candy as making the protection of the spirits of the deceased fall upon oneself, while the last line is the same as Ungo's bit about spirit fall. I will talk more about Spiritfall and the Shugas in future episodes, when what I believe to be the way they actually function will become much clearer. Lastly, we have the Shuriken Wheel. The name of Dogen comes up again, this time not as a doctor, but as a master of mechanical contraptions, as it would be more accurately translated. The same friend that helped me in the translations for the previous episode pointed out that the word karakuri is also used to mean traps, which works well with this setup of ninja tools for assassination. The final line of the description is also slightly different. In Japanese, it specifies that the same craftsmanship with ninja contraptions was also used in the creation of the shinobi prosthetic, implying that it was Dogen that built that as well. The figure of Dogen is then linked to a lot of different characters in this game for now. It was apparently Emma's master. He seems to have built the shinobi prosthetic that the Sculptor gave us, and this specific item was in the possession of one of the mysterious figures that kidnapped Kuro, meaning that somehow they seem to have their hands on Dogen's creations as well. So quite a mysterious character is being set up here. Now, the last of the items that we find in this section of gameplay is the light coin purse. But while that is not worth talking about in terms of translation, because the description is pretty accurate and it's just a bag of coins, it is a nice segue into the first of the cultural reference that I want to talk about, namely money in Sekiro. Now, the English translation they decided on for the kanji used to indicate the currency in Sekiro is sen. Now, I think that is not exactly correct, because it is true that the kanji can be pronounced sen, but that indicates a specific currency that wasn't used until 1873 and just means cent or a fraction of a yen. During Sekiro's time period, that word just meant something like spare change, and was instead pronounced zeni, small coins made out of iron and copper rather than noble metals like gold and silver. Now, that is a bit confusing to me, because the illustration of the coin bag shows them being clearly filled with what looks like koban, which were a specific kind of oval-shaped gold coins, while the little UI prompt we get when we acquire money is instead shaped like proper zeni coins. Now, I'm probably just overthinking this whole thing, but I did go down quite a rabbit hole in researching medieval Japanese currency, so if anyone is interested, I included a little bit of a paragraph of what I found in the description. Now I would like to move on to more important cultural references and details instead. One of the most striking features of the dilapidated temple are definitely the countless talismans that are affixed to its walls. These are actual religious implements. They are called ofuda or gofu and can be granted by both Shinto shrines and Buddhist temple. The way they work is that they are supposedly imbued with a blessing from a Shinto kami or a revered Buddhist figure, and each of them serves a specific purpose, such as a generic bringer of good luck, purifying a spiritually corrupt area, or protecting from evil influences. They can be either carried around by a person or affixed to a structure, and they are supposed to be changed yearly to avoid spiritual stagnation, which in Japanese belief is one of the main sources of impurity and corruption. This means that this area was considered dangerous enough on a spiritual level to be completely filled with these protections, but also the fact that it is so abandoned now means that these talismans that were probably supposed to be keeping the corruption and demonic influence of the place at bay have now become just part of the overall abandonment of this place, making it unwelcome to most people, except apparently those that have nowhere else to go. Next, as we've seen, Ashina samurai are equipped with rifles. The history of firearms in Japan is fascinating, and I've included a lot of more details in the description, but for now, suffice to say that by this time period, firearms were very common in Japanese standing armies. They were earlier imported from China, and it was Oda Nobunaga that started using them regularly to defeat the power imbalance that the samurai caste had up until that point. Samurai's families were the ones with the better training and the better equipment, which made them almost unbeatable without some kind of special method, and rifles and cannons and other firearms were that method. They were the great equalizer that completely changed the way the battles were fought in Japan. It's interesting that Ashina has them, and we'll discover much more later as to where they acquired them, but for now I will conclude by saying that the main thing that made them so good is that they could be used by peasants and even by women in a way that made them as deadly as a trained samurai with a bow or a sword. And even if they were maybe less reliable than those weapons, this makes the protection, especially of isolated places like this, much easier, because you can arm the entire population basically. I think that what we're fighting here are still samurais that are trained with them, but it's an important detail, I think, that will become much more relevant as we go further into the game. Now, regarding this beautiful giant chicken we can find here, and thinking back on the giant geckos we found in the tutorial, giant animals are very common in Japanese folklore, as a commonly held superstition is that animals could acquire human intelligence and even supernatural powers if they live long enough, usually exponentially growing in size in the process. In Sekiro, the great size of some of the animals encountered are almost certainly linked more to the special properties of Ashina, which we'll discover more about in the future, rather than this classical folkloristic belief. But this tendency to use giant animals rather than just straight up monster for most non-human enemies encountered in the game contributes to giving the fantasy aspects of the setting a more traditional character throughout. Roosters in particular have a ton of folkloristic and religious significance attached to them, depending on where you go in Japan, including being part of the Chinese zodiac, embodying the virtue of courage, acting as protection against fire, being divine messages, and appearing as helpful figures in numerous myths and legends, just to name a few. But to be fair, all of that is not really relevant to the marginal role they play in Sekiro, where they mostly just are adorable, deadly, humongous chickens. And lastly, Buddhist sculpture features prominently in Sekiro, starting from the figure of the sculpture and leading to this mysterious carving that surround the offertory box. And we'll see much later there are going to be much more extreme examples of it, but I am sad to say that I really am out of my depth regarding this subject, which would require a much more extensive level of preparation than what I'm equipped with to provide the analysis it deserves. I have included a link to a very thorough database of Buddhist art if anyone is interested, together with some interesting facts that are linked to Sekiro, and I use those to draw some conclusions, but yeah, be warned that there is probably a lot of nuance that I'm just missing when I'm playing this game. What I could surmise from the research that I've done are mainly these two details that are relevant right now. The first is that I believe that the true sculpture mentioned by the sculpture was probably inspired by the historical figure of Enku, who was an itinerant ascetic monk who is allegedly responsible for around 120,000 pieces of Buddhist sculpture, and that was the main inspiration for the resurgence of Buddhist sculpture into the 17th century, and the fact that all the pieces of sculpture, especially the stone sculpture like those around the offertory box we find in Sekiro, is really ancient. Because during the Sengoku period, because of all the civil unrest, Buddhist sculpture really wasn't practiced, it wasn't popular, it wasn't in any way endorsed by the state, and stone sculpture was never really popular at all in Japan, where they favored instead wooden sculptures. So This gives the land of Ashina this feeling of being a very spiritual place and having been so for a very, very long time. And this was it for this episode. Thank you so much for sticking until the end. This was shorter than the first one, but not by the margin that I hoped, so I really hope that going forward I will get better at it and maybe manage to make shorter and shorter episodes where I can say everything that I want to say in a more concise and organized manner. But until then, I hope that you had fun and you found this interesting, and I will see you next time. Have a good day now.